You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. I'm joined today by Barb Hill. She is a writer and licensed mental health therapist who is passionate about supporting others in their navigation of faith and mental health. In 2019, Barb founded Holding Space Counseling, a thriving group practice in Franklin, Tennessee, where she works as a trauma therapist as well as oversees and supervises other therapists in their clinical work. Barb's book, Seasons of Waiting, 52 Devotionals, is available now. She calls Tennessee home and lives in Nashville with her pup, Nash. This is truly a beautiful conversation about self-discovery, faith, and what it means to hold space. Barb shares her journey to becoming a therapist, how she bridges the gap between faith and mental health for herself and for her clients, and we talk about the universal experience of waiting and all of the mental health challenges it could evoke in us. So stay tuned after my final thoughts, as always, and here's Barb. Hey, Barb. So nice to meet you. Thank you for being here with me today.
Oh, nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're just sharing all of our Kevin Bacons of social media, the different connections and things. And here we are finally. So
I know. I'm excited.
yeah. All right. So I typically just start with my interviews with just asking you to share a little bit about why you became a therapist. Why did you become a counselor?
hmm Yeah, so it was definitely a non-linear path that I took to get here, which when I talk to a lot of therapist friends of mine, we kind of share that experience. So I often say that I lived like 9 lives before I became a therapist, which I can see now in sitting with people. It gives me a lot of different life experience to sit with people coming from a lot of different places. So I'm grateful for it. But along the way, it was full of twists and turns, and I didn't really know where I was ultimately going to land. Um, but I would say, the through line in all the different careers I pursued until I pursued counseling was really like this passion to help people. And for me, the ultimate expression of that is as a therapist. And I think young in my life, like when I was younger, I always loved asking questions and kind of helping guide people into like a different perspective or way of looking at something, or just really celebrating moments where they made decisions that they felt good about. And so all the things that I do now, I can look back on my life and see like, oh, I always loved doing that.
Mhm.
And I pursued a lot of different careers, I think in the pursuit of that. So it's cool to be a therapist now. And as it's like the ultimate expression of that for me.
Mhm. Mhm. Looking back, can you identify perhaps what what you think influenced or shaped your desire to help people?
Mm, hmm It's a great question. I think part of it is my parents' story. Actually, they came from, I didn't have this language growing up, but they came from a lot of trauma growing up,
Mhm.
and I think they were always very open with their own story. their own experiences, and how they really came out of a lot of adversity and
Mm,
difficulty growing up. And so I think in those formative years, it was knowing my parents' story and knowing what they overcame. And honestly, they didn't have access to what, I do now, and a lot of people my age do. They grew up in a generation where there was so much stigma around mental health.
mhm,
So the idea of seeing a therapist to process their trauma was not something that was really accessible to them. So I think a big part of it was growing up with my parents and knowing their story. And I would say definitely my own experiences too. Of navigating grief and loss and traumatic experiences of my own. And again, I didn't grow up in an environment that exposed me to the world of mental health and therapy until I really had this passion to pursue it myself. And then I really um, started doing my own work. So I feel like it was probably like a interweaving, so to speak, of my parents' story and my own experiences, kind of ultimately leading me to and shaping me towards the direction of this work.
mhm. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay, okay.
Mhm.
And just out of curiosity, do you have siblings?
I don't. I'm an only child.
Okay. I was going to ask, I always find it interesting to see how perhaps siblings in a situation sort of come out of those experiences and what they do with it, because it can either be totally the same or totally opposite. And
Mhm.
um, any thoughts on your experience as an only child growing up
Mhm.
and things, whether it's related to, parental trauma or not? Just it seems like a
Mhm.
unique experience these days.
Mhm. Yes, yes, it is. I always begged my parents for a sibling.
Hmm.
So growing up, I always wanted a brother or sister. And I think, like most things, it came with some pros and cons. I think, um, my parents, because of their upbringing, really didn't plan on having children. I was like the biggest surprise.
Mm,
I think they just felt ill-equipped to be parents because
mm,
of their own upbringing. So, they really did a remarkable job with like what they had been given in their own childhood. So, but I would say like a couple of things that come to mind is one, I think my friends took on like a whole different like value or meaning to me. It's my friends almost became an extension of my family, which I think can be a great thing and also a tricky thing because at the end of the day, there are friends that feel like family, and at the same time, friend and family is different. The some of the expectations are different. So I think trying to um, parse out those expectations along the way of like, okay, this friend feels like a family member, and at the same time, these are different buckets.
mhm.
Um, so I would say that's one thing. Another thing is I think as an only child, there are no buffers.
Yeah.
So all the love, all the everything comes in your direction. So I think like trying to navigate that and some of the pressure and the
Mm,
yeah, energy that's coming your way as an only child.
mhm. Yeah, I don't think people think about that often. It's like, yes, you get all of the love and attention, but like you said, you also get all of the pressure and all of the expectation. And I think even as adults too, right, you get to a certain point where a lot of the responsibility then falls to you, of either caring for your parents or just being a support system, all of that. It's yeah, and,
Mhm.
I have half siblings, that I call my siblings, but we didn't grow up in the same house, and um they're a little bit older than I am. So it's I often feel like I grew up a lot like an only child. And my very best friend from like birth is an only child as well. And I totally see that. Like we sort of treated each other like sisters for a long time. And then we say that we moved to more of like a cousin type feeling. Um, but I know from her perspective, she's only shared this with me recently, is that even though I actually for most of my life felt closer to her than my own siblings, she, as an outsider looking in, always kind of saw it like, oh, but she still has her siblings,
Mm,
so I see what you're saying. Like, it's when I say she still has her siblings, I just mean like, I think
mm,
she always like thought, not always, I shouldn't speak for her, but I think it was almost like, at the end of the day, I have siblings to fall back on, so to speak,
mhm,
that
mhm,
she didn't have. And I think that just like internally created some stress, I don't know.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very real. I think especially as my parents get older, there's like different considerations for what life will look like. Um, as they get older and as they pass away, it is like kind of a unique process to move
Yeah.
through as an only child.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say something else about that. Oh, I was thinking about it too. Like, I also remember having to really grapple with making friends, especially getting into middle school, high school. My one friend and I always joke about this, that she's the oldest of three, and she came over my house for like one of the first times, and we're in my room, and she remembers it so clearly, but she just started like looking through my stuff and like opening my drawers and this and that, and she like didn't think anything of it, but I'm looking at her like, excuse me, like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I just wanted to see like your shorts and stuff. Like, I was like, pardon, like, get out. Like, it was a
Oh my
whole
God.
thing of like not being used to having someone else in your space. I
Oh my
don't
God.
know. Yeah. But I think, and just to kind of harp on this one more time, the other thing I've noticed in sort of growing up this way, at least for myself, is that I didn't think much of it in high school, college, but certainly now as an adult, have sometimes wondered if I find it a little bit challenging to make friends because I overthink every interaction. Whereas, like, I even witness with my kids as toddlers, like, when they meet new people, they just almost like treat new kids like they treat their brother and their sister. And it's like, whoa, I can't relate to that at all. So I'm
Mhm.
over here like overthinking every little interaction because I didn't really have that like constant
Mm.
bounce off person. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think navigating friendship as an adult is tricky.
Yeah.
I think especially over the last maybe like 3 years post-pandemic, the landscape around friendship, I think, has shifted in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
I think even before the pandemic, adult friendships can be tricky to navigate. But I think even after, there's like some added complexities that we didn't have to deal with
Yeah.
then that we are dealing with now. So that's something I talk with clients about a lot, is just navigating adult friendships. And it's funny because a lot of the same stuff that we were confronted with when we were
Mm.
young, we're still confronted with now.
Yeah.
And I think it catches us by surprise sometimes, when we're like, wait, I feel left out like I did
Yeah.
when I was 12, so I think we don't really outgrow a lot of the dynamics that we might have felt when we were young. Hopefully we're just better equipped as adults to move through those complexities.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to get into your practice and what you do in a bit. But before we do, I think, you mentioned it and I read from, your bio and things, that you have quite a journey career path. Would you share a little bit about, some of the main, positions that you held before pursuing counseling?
Yeah. So I had such a different picture in my head, for what my life would look like, what career I might have. My undergrad was in biblical studies. Faith was a big influencer in my life growing up. I had this picture of being a nurse in some underdeveloped country somewhere, and I pursued nursing as well. I was pre-nursing while I was doing my undergrad in biblical studies, and then experienced a big loss in my life. And so I pivoted and put nursing on the back burner for a little bit, completed my undergrad, graduated from that program, picked nursing back up, and realized as much as I still loved the medical field, it wasn't it wasn't going to be for me, which was, some grief there, because that was always a part of the picture that I had had in my mind. And then I ended up moving overseas to Zambia for about a year doing some missionary work. And that was a really incredible, transformative experience for me in a ton of ways. Came back, worked in the corporate sector for a while. Actually, I had done some of that before I moved to Zambia, and then picked it back up when I came back, and worked for a plastic surgeon for a period of time, went to esthetician school, worked in the beauty industry. And then through a series of events, the whole idea of becoming a counselor really just fell into my heart, so to speak, through some conversations I had with some friends of mine. And like I was saying before, because I wasn't exposed to that world earlier in life, I didn't even realize I could do that as a job
Hmm.
until these conversations. So I initially pursued a master's of biblical counseling, and I did that online. And when I was in that second year of my program, I learned more about human trafficking, and found an anti-human trafficking organization based in California. And so I moved out to California. I moved my whole life from Baltimore to California. It was like a big leap of faith. Finished my program out there, realized I wanted to work more with trauma survivors and work more as a trauma therapist. So had a little bit more schooling to do, moved from California to Chicago to finish that up. And then in 2018, moved to Nashville. So lots of twists and turns. Felt
Wow.
like a little nomad at some
Yeah.
point, just bopping from one place to the next. But um, I think of like even the people that I accumulated, so to speak, along the way are some of my dearest and best friends. So yeah, I see a lot of value in all those pieces.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, all right. So something that I've covered a little bit, and I'm curious your take on it. Um, hmm, I think there are times, and I'm gonna say this briefly, and I'm gonna hope you know what I'm asking because I'm not gonna have really eloquent words for it. But in my experience, there is sometimes a difficulty bridging the gap between religion and mental health services. What do you see there? Like you're nodding. What is the question that I need to ask that you can answer? Because it's hard to talk about. I don't want to offend anyone. And I know that there's a lot that goes into religious beliefs. I think a lot of it's cultural. Like, so let's do that. What is your experience with either your own beliefs and or like kind of bridging the gap for like I didn't even know um biblical counseling was a thing. Like I'd never even heard of that. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yes, no, I love this question because I think it's a really important one too. I think for so long, like faith and spirituality and mental health were siloed off from one another.
Mhm.
And a really big passion of mine is figuring out like a sensitive and appropriate way to bring those worlds together, based, especially when I think of my work with clients, like especially based on like what are your spiritual values. Because I think regardless of your orientation around faith, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever it looks like, spirituality is such a beautiful part of recovery and of becoming more integrated, more whole. Just this believing in something or someone bigger than you. There's something really transformative about that, especially in recovery. Like, I think that's why in the 12-step world, faith is really integrated into those 12-step meetings. And I think it really helps in the recovery process, to know that you have access to something outside of you that could assist you, comfort you could pray to. Um, I mean, for me, I identify as a Christian, and my faith has obviously played, a big role in my life and just how I move through the world. Um, and in my work with clients, I live in Nashville, so I'm in the Bible Belt. So there's a
Mm.
lot of, people that would say that they're Christian, but maybe don't even know fully what that means to them.
Mm.
And then you have a lot of other people who have experienced a good bit of spiritual trauma or spiritual abuse. And so I'm working with a lot of those people who are deconstructing their faith, reconstructing their faith, kind of reimagining what does it look like to believe in God, what aligns with my values when it comes to faith and spirituality. So it's one of the things that I really love working with clients around, faith and spirituality. And obviously, like, I have zero interest in imposing my own values on people. I really want to create a safe space for them to process and explore whatever it is that, they believe, and helping them find some solid ground underneath their feet when it comes to faith.
Mhm. How how did Christianity come to you? Was that through your family or school, or
Mhm.
where did that come from?
Yeah, so it came from my parents. Um, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents have a wild and crazy story of like how they came to faith. And I grew up in like church was very much like woven into my normal routine and day to day. I went to a Christian school, so it was everywhere. It was all
Okay.
around me. And there were some really pivotal moments where I had to decide if it was also mine,
Mm.
like making it personal, that it wasn't something that I identified with because it was all around me. I really wanted it to be a personal choice. So I definitely went on my own journey with it, especially through some losses and experiences that I had that, kind of put me face to face with, okay, do I believe this, or is this just something that I believe by association?
Mhm.
Um, and that was like a really difficult, but beautiful process to go through.
Mhm. If you don't mind sharing, what are some of the things that you did to really grapple with that? Like, I'm asking mostly because, I grew up Catholic, and I went to Catholic schools and all the things. But unfortunately, it's not really something that I've continued into my adult life. And now, as a parent, it's that question of, do I get involved again? Do I want to, for my kids, really? And there's certain aspects, like all the traditions, and like, of course, we celebrate Christmas, like we do all the things, but it's like, I'll be honest with you, on the list of priorities of things, it's not high. I'm trying to,
Mhm,
this past 2 years, I've been trying to just get through a day. um, and
mhm,
we're getting there. We're getting there. But it is something that I think about often. And I'm just curious kind of what that work looked like for you and how you went about it.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, one big thing that comes to mind is, like just processing my thoughts in a trusted community, like with people that I love and feel
Mm,
safe with, to have a sounding board of like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. These are the questions that I'm asking. This is what doesn't make sense to me. This is what's resonating with me. I think trying to explore faith in isolation is really difficult.
mhm.
Um, so exploring it in community has been really helpful for me. Like even here in Nashville, when I first moved here, a girl that I knew very loosely, decided to, just get a bunch of girls together in her house just to talk about faith. And,
Hmm.
we were only supposed to meet for a month, and we all connected so well that we're now 5 years in to
Wow.
meeting with
Oh my
each
goodness,
other.
that's amazing.
And what's really cool and unique about it is none of us are associated with the same church. Some
Huh.
people are right in the middle of a deconstruction of their faith. Others have reconstructed. Some go to church, some don't. Like it's very diverse politically, but like everybody's in different places. And I
Cool.
love that because I think in a lot of settings, things can become like an echo chamber where everybody's just reinforcing each other's narratives and not challenging each other to think differently. So again, just like the community piece and a diverse community, I guess that would be the caveat, like people who can challenge you to think differently.
Mhm.
Um, so community, I would say like, getting out in nature has been a really cool way to connect with God, for me. And, there's a couple parks out here in Nashville that I love and I go to very often. And it's just a way to feel really grounded and for me to pray and to ask questions and to connect. So I would say like being out in nature and being in community have been two of the most essential parts of developing my faith.
Awesome. That's really cool about the group of women. That sounds incredible. When you went to Zambia, were you at what point in your journey was that? Were you solid in your beliefs, or was that part of the processing? Like where were you in your head when you went there?
Mm. So I would say, so I was post my undergrad. So I think I was armed with a whole lot of information about God. And then I think being in Zambia was almost like working it all out, like moving
Okay.
it from my head to my heart. And I think being exposed to such a different culture, a different part of the world was very humbling for me, to see the simplicity of the way people experience their faith there and experience God. I saw this contrast between how complicated it can become in the West versus out there. There's this beautiful simplicity to them, you know, monetarily, material wise, they have very little. And on one hand, there's like a lot of sorrow around that. And at the same time, they have a lot of joy and a lot of simplicity that was very moving to me. So I think that was also like forming me in like my view of faith and spirituality as well, being there, and just being out of my comfort zone. I think just being exposed to so many different things than what I grew up with and being, yeah, so out of my comfort zone, like living in the middle of nowhere, with people that are so different than me. It was so good. It was so healthy for me.
Hmm. I can only imagine how humbling and healthy that would be. I
Mhm.
feel like it would be just like a smack in the face of self-awareness. Like
Mhm.
you think you know who you are, you think you know what you're about, and you think you got life figured out. And it's like, no, I'm just gonna plop you here.
Yeah.
Anything. Let me phrase this intentionally.
Mhm.
Was there anything about that experience for you that you took home or internalized as like, I'm not actually thrilled with this in my life or about myself that you learned there about yourself or your life that you came home and were like, okay, these things have to be different, or I don't know, just I guess
Mhm.
touching on sort of the reflection aspect of it.
Mhm. Yes, I love that question. And I don't know that I've ever been asked that, so that's really cool. What immediately came to mind was, and I guess it goes along with the simplicity theme. I think one of the first things that I noticed the first couple months of being there was how many things we fit into a day here. Like I
Mm,
22 things I would, or more that I, would do in a day here. Everything's really fast paced. I don't want to overgeneralize, but for my life, like everything was really fast paced. I was kind of just always rushing from one thing to the next. And I think that's a lot of just how our world is wired over here.
mhm,
Um, and being there, I would do maybe two things in
yeah.
a day. Like the pace was so much slower and it was very healing for me. I was coming off of ending a long relationship and I was grieving and it was like the perfect place to be to just like slow down
Mm,
and heal. So I think when I came back to the States, I really strive to incorporate practices in my life that could help me slow down. And when I think about the work that I do with clients, that's a lot of what I try to bring in. Let's slow everything down.
mhm,
Because I think it's difficult to heal or process if we're moving at really high speeds. But if we can slow down, the things that we can see and connect to is really different. So I would say that that was a real gift being there, is the ability to slow down,
mhm.
and how that was a catalyst for my own healing while I was there.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that seems to be a theme. Almost every episode, someone mentions slowing down, whether it's me or the guest. It's
Mhm.
just we're trying to do everything all the time and at the fastest pace possible, and we end up just burning out, and it
Yeah,
doesn't work.
yeah.
Um, All right. This may be a totally like a random question, and you can tell me if it's like of zero interest of you, but for you, but esthetician, working for a plastic surgeon, that portion of your life, the reason I have a question around it is that my show and my own journey, right, of the last however long 2 years now, it's like amazing that
Mm,
life has been going on this long with this thing,
mm,
is a lot of work around body image and that sort of thing, and I can only imagine possibly what you experience working for a plastic surgeon around body image, and I don't know, did any of that have an impact on you and how you view yourself or the work you do today?
yeah. When I look back, and again, I wasn't armed with this language then the way I am now, but when I look back on my time working for the plastic surgeon, um, there was so much body dysmorphia,
Yeah.
because in the patients that he would see and do these cosmetic procedures on, and I would watch this pretty significant transformation in how their level of confidence and how they saw themselves. And on one hand, I'm like, oh, that's great, like that,
Mhm,
you feel better in your body and you feel more confident. um and at the same time, it made me think, this the and often patients would become addicted to
mm,
getting procedures.
mhm,
It kind of became this insatiable thing that it was feeding. And he, thankfully, he was one of the good ones out there that when he noticed that that was what was driving the desire for additional procedures, he would say no, and I'm going
mhm,
to refer you to some people that maybe can talk you through some of the body dysmorphia stuff that's coming up for you.
mhm,
So looking back, that's definitely one of the things that I noticed. And I think for females in general, myself included, like I think we all go on our journey when it comes to body image, relationship to food, um, yeah, relationship to our body. And I don't know any woman that hasn't gone through some sort of process around that and
yeah,
trying to figure out, like, what does a healthy relationship with my body look like? Healthy relationship with exercise and movement and food and all of that. I think there's a lot of challenges stacked up against us when it comes to like figuring out how to settle into a healthy rhythm in our
mhm,
relationship to our bodies.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've, had many a therapy session. I'm looking up at all of the books that I've read about it and all of the podcasts I've listened to, and, we're still not there wherever there is, and even saying that, I know we never really get there. It's a lifelong process. Yeah, it's a lot. So, anyway, thank you for
Mhm,
sharing that,
mhm,
and I guess lastly, just sticking with, kind of wrapping up your very short version of what sounds like a very incredibly fulfilling and challenging journey
mhm,
here. But the work that you did with trauma survivors and human trafficking, is there anything in particular about that experience that sticks out to you that you like to share that, is relevant at all to what we've already talked about? Or I don't know. I don't
mhm.
want to like push you totally too hard on every little detail of your life, but it feels like that's pretty significant.
Yes. I mean, that was such a pivotal part of what led me in the direction to continue my studies so that I could work as a trauma therapist. So I'm so grateful for the work that I did at the organization I was with and being exposed to that level of recovery and trauma healing. It was, I mean, up to that point, I had never been exposed to that level of trauma. So again, very humbling. And I think one
Were
thing
you
that
counseling?
I was almost more acting as like a case manager. Like I was
Okay.
helping more with like the practical side. I was also helping to receive the stories of the people that were coming into
Mm.
our shelters, and then putting their stories in really like story form so that we could share it with our partnerships so that we could bring in funds for the work that we were doing.
Wow.
So to receive kind of, and just like the patience and the sensitivity that goes into asking a trauma survivor of that nature, like, can you tell me whatever you have capacity for? And then I'll
Wow.
take it and run with it and
Hmm.
be able to share it in a way that people can connect with it. Because I think the thing with human trafficking in particular is when people just hear statistics, it's really dehumanizing. But if they can connect to somebody's story, it's a
Hmm.
completely different experience. So that's what we really hope to do is help a person connect to a person in their lived experience. So yeah, I don't know that I would be where I am if I hadn't worked with that organization, and been exposed to, working with human trafficking survivors.
Hmm. Hmm. I cut you off. You were gonna say you started to say the one thing that, and I cut you off, and I don't know if you remember
Oh,
what you were
oh,
gonna say,
no,
but
you're fine. You're fine. I was just gonna say I think what I learned then that I really incorporate now in my trauma work is how important pacing is.
Mm,
That we gotta, as a therapist, as a trauma therapist, really align myself with the pace that works for my client. Because if I have an agenda and I'm trying to move at 50 miles an hour and they only have capacity to move at 10,
mhm,
that's not going to be good for them. So that was something I learned really early on is my pace has to be in sync with their pace. And, as we build rapport and safety is established, then we can start moving a little quicker. But
mhm.
yeah, that's been really helpful for me now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it seems, particularly, hearing your story, I think the name of your practice, Holding Space, is very it takes on a different meaning. I think
Mm,
that's kind of become a buzzy phrase, at least in my world. I don't know. I just mostly follow and listen to therapists and all the things, so that feels buzzy to me. But now hearing your story, it's like you basically spent most of your adult life holding space for people. And um, is there? I the one thing that comes to mind when as I say that is, it is it as does it feel as heavy as it might sound? I know we're kind of taking a whole, like, life and putting it into an hour here, but, how do you hold that amount of stories and trauma, and how do you protect yourself from being, I don't wanna use the wrong words, but, like, being, weighed down by it, or being, I don't know, what words would you put towards it, and how do you sort of, I don't know, protect yourself or arm yourself, or whatever the appropriate words are
mm,
for it?
yeah, yeah. There's such an ebb and flow to in terms of like my experience of the space that I'm holding and the stories that I'm holding. On some days, I feel like I have such a huge capacity for it. And on other days, I have a little bit less of a capacity, in terms of like the effect that it's having on me.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent way to put it, yes.
Yes. But the thing that I love about the idea of the term holding space is, and this is a good challenge for me always, because my personal tendency and what I've done a lot of work around is to not rush in and rescue
Mm,
and over function when somebody is wrestling through something or struggling through something or feeling, a difficult emotion. So that the term holding space is this constant reminder that my job is not to rush in and rescue them from the discomfort, but
mm,
it's to hold that tension with them so that they're not holding it by themselves. And I think that really does limit some of the additional energy that I could expend if holding space included rushing in and rescuing or over functioning, in assistance for my client. But it's really just like, I'm going to hold this tension with you. I'm going to hold this space where you're kind of struggling, wrestling through something, knowing that there's so much value in that process and in the discomfort that that brings up. And I think the importance of bringing in levity, that it can't just all be heavy, that there needs to be
mhm,
this rhythm of like depth and yes, heaviness, but then bringing in levity, and lightness where it's appropriate and where you can. Finding moments to, yeah, to bring in joy and humor, like again, when it's appropriate in the work, because it is heavy a lot of the time. So I think bringing in the levity is really important. And then of course, having practices in my life to care for myself is huge. And moving my body is a really big way. So whether that's going on a walk or doing yoga, so, restorative movement is really helpful for me. I even have some like just visual exercises that I walk through at the end of the day where I just kind of take each client and faith is obviously, like we've said, important to me. So I just take each client and I'm like, okay, God, I'm putting them in
Mm,
your hands to care for them well. I'm so limited, but where I'm limited, I can recognize that there's unlimited resources at your end. So just knowing like I'm not God, I'm not the rescuer, the helper, the fixer in this, in other ways. In some ways I do show up that way, but recognizing my limitations and seeing that as a good thing.
yeah. Wow, that's really beautiful. I like that, your visual exercise.
Mhm.
That's a warm and fuzzy feeling. Um, um, I think that, you know, I often talk a lot about, maybe the misconceptions about therapy and, a lot of the ones that typically come up are, that you don't, you know, that, people often think like, oh, you have to have like be like crazy or like something's super wrong with you to go. And it's like not that. And I think that one that we don't talk about a lot is exactly as you mentioned, like, yeah, a therapist is not there to save you. It's not there to tell you what to do, right? And like give you this plan and say, okay, here's you got a problem, here's what you do to fix it. It's like that's not how it works. And that's challenging when you're on the other side and all you want is someone to tell you what to do. But if you're there long enough, you really, in my experience, like it is. It's way better, even though it takes longer to sort of come to everything on your own. And
Mhm.
it all happens in time.
Mhm.
Um, it's frustrating, but we do it.
Mhm.
Um, all right. So I think at least based on your, online and social presence, it seems to me that you as almost equally, if not more so, identify as a writer and author as you do a counselor. So what is your experience with writing? Why do it at all? And then of course, your book, Seasons of Waiting, if you want to share a little bit about that.
Mhm. Yeah, so writing has always been a favorite pastime for me, a personal way of processing my own thoughts and feelings and experiences. I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram. I'm sure you are, but I'm
Hmm.
an Enneagram too. So journaling has been a really important practice for me to connect with myself
Okay.
because I can be so others focused,
Mm.
and forget to check in on what I'm feeling and how I'm doing, which is easily exposed if somebody asks me an intentional "How are you?" How I respond to that is really telling, um, for, like, how much time I've spent for myself. So, yeah, so writing has always been a way to process, my own thoughts and feelings, and I was given this really incredible opportunity almost 4 years ago now to write this book, and the concept of the book had been in my heart for a while, but I had no clue how I would make something like that happen. I had helped, a couple of writers with some like editing stuff, some creative direction stuff, but no formal connections to the publishing world. So it really felt like a true miracle the way that it all came together. And my friend who did the illustrations made the book really beautiful. And it's Seasons of Waiting is a devotional that's very much a blend of faith and mental health, and all centered around this topic of waiting. And of course, like I have my own personal experience of waiting, but understanding that waiting is a universal human experience, that all of us are waiting for something at any given time in our lives, whether it's something big like a baby or a career shift, financial breakthrough, getting married, or if it's waiting for blood work to come back, or, so I think the idea of waiting and how it challenges us and brings up a lot of mental health related stuff for us. It brings up the fear of the unknown. How do I navigate uncertainty? What do I, if I'm really outcomes or outcome oriented, what do I do when I'm invited into a process? Because waiting is very much a process. And it reveals, I think, a lot about ourselves. So that's more like the content of the book. But I think the opportunity to write it just feels like such a gift. And the process of writing it was very transformative for me too.
Mhm.
Um, it required a lot. I had to dig pretty deep, and writing it also in and amongst like all the other stuff that I was doing. It was a wild ride, but it's really special that it's like done and it's out there for people to hopefully enjoy.
Mhm. Do you share is the book included in the book, like, your story with waiting, or are you like, how is this content presented?
hmm Yeah, so it's a 52-week devotional, and the way that it's structured,
Oh, I missed that. Okay.
mhm, yeah, yeah. So it's like a basically as close to a daily devotional as I could make it. And on that first day of the week, there's like a longer form devotional, and then on the days that follow, there are these kind of mini devotionals that are very experiential. So they include some prompts, and they really invite the reader to engage
Mm,
the content in a more holistic, experiential way. Because I really wanted it to be more than information gathering. I wanted it for the reader to really internalize what was written. And it's very much a blend of including my own story around waiting, which, for me, it's waiting for a family of my own. And but also wanting to include my story in a way that people can connect with the vulnerability of it, while also knowing that if their waiting story looks different than mine, that's okay. Because a lot of the feelings that we experience, like if we're waiting for a baby versus, waiting for, a spouse, is a lot of those feelings are the same: disappointment, grief, confusion, anger, you name it. Like there's a lot of similarities in what we feel and experience when we're waiting for big things like that in our lives. So, yeah, definitely including my own story, my own work, like in therapy. My therapist is all over that book. It was fun to give that to her. I'm like, Laura, here you go. You're named in about 20 of these devotionals. Um, so yeah, including my own story, and then of course like incorporating faith in there, and then my own work with clients, like some stories about some of the work that I've done with clients. And so it's very much a blend of a lot of different things.
okay. Okay, I think that the, main crux of my lack of understanding initially was that I did not know what a devotional was, and now I do,
Mhm.
so thank you very
Yeah.
much. Um, and I also joke with my therapist that, like, at some point like, well, I used to make TikToks about her, not naming her, but she thought that was pretty funny, and we,
Mhm.
I don't know if you saw, um, who was it? Jonah Hill. He did a documentary recently with his therapist,
Yes.
and, my therapist said to me, she goes, "I first turned it on and I was like, 'Who would do this?'" And she goes, "Oh, Christy's gonna do this to me one day."
I
Anyway,
loved that.
yeah.
It
Oh, it
was
was
so
so good.
like so precious to watch.
So good.
Mhm.
Okay, and so um, I think that it sounds absolutely beautiful, your book, and, absolutely love what you did there with waiting because it's so unbelievably true, and I think some of the best, and I mean this positively, which is
Mhm.
often a terrible way of starting something, but it's so simple
Mhm.
that I don't know, like, I often find that, like, the simpler the concept, the harder it hits almost,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
Um, and I think I would just ask you because I do have some very close people in my life who either are still or were recently, in that same waiting period that you shared of waiting for a family of your own and Is there anything from your work in writing the book or just in your experience that you would want to say to those women listening about that?
Yes, a lot. I would say a lot. But one of the things that feels most important to say is that the waiting isn't their fault.
Mm,
There's a lot of shame that can come along with long seasons of waiting.
mm,
We turn inward and start assuming that the reason why things haven't worked out is because there's something wrong with us. And so, really externalizing those stories of shame and exchanging them for what's really true, that the wait isn't their fault. There's nothing wrong with them. Um, and in the very first devotional of the book, I address that right from the beginning. And it,
mm,
it comes out of a conversation with my therapist,
mm,
where she offers me a completely different perspective of why I've waited, that it's not because of something wrong, but it's because of all that's right.
mm,
And that it really matters who I end up with, or, what, even if somebody's not looking for a spouse. So, the circumstances of how our waiting unfolds and the fulfillment of our longings unfold, like, it all matters.
mhm,
And so I would say that it's not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. And to really externalize those negative stories and exchange it for what's actually true about you.
mhm, mhm. Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, Barb, I've held you to our time now. I could ask you a lot more of that, but I'm going to respect your time.
Mhm.
Is there anything, just lingering on your heart, mind, and soul around this conversation that you would want to say or share or make sure to leave people with today?
Mhm. I feel like we covered some really great ground, and it felt like such a multifaceted conversation, kind of.
Tend to
And
do
I
that.
I love that though. No, it didn't feel chaotic, rather, like, it felt very cohesive and just multifaceted. And I love the questions that you asked and kind of what it drew out of me too in my own story, things I haven't thought of in a long time. So I appreciated it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and thank you for sharing all that you did. I appreciate it.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Okay, so I first have to share that Barb was kind enough to share a copy of her book with me, and it is breathtakingly stunning. It looks beautiful, it reads beautifully, and it just brings a smile to my face every time I pick it up. Truly, it is so warm and fuzzy and heartfelt. And when I say warm and fuzzy, I don't mean fluffy. It's extremely meaningful, but it just feels cozy when you pick it up. And like I said, it is truly illustrated beautifully, and I just love it. And to reiterate what I said to Barb, that faith and religion really are not active in my life right now. And even still, this book hits the way she weaves mental health and faith together makes this book very accessible and relatable to anyone. It reminds me of a conversation I had recently with Danny Kenny. Her episode has not come out yet, but she said that she calls this sort of, I guess, intersection, the weave, she calls it GUS, and it stands for God, Universe, or Spirit, because whatever you call it, it's a higher power, a higher being. It's something bigger than you. And that is what Barb does with this book. And I highly recommend you get your hands on a copy. I will link it in the show notes. Anyway, the main takeaways for me from this conversation are ones that even now, I don't know, I just spent a lot of time thinking about them. I really dig what Barb said about making faith her own rather than hers by association. This really resonated with me. I mentioned on the show I grew up Catholic, um, grew up going to church on and off, going to Catholic school, and grew up with a lot of Catholic people around me in my community, in my town, in my schools, obviously, um, where it just was sort of what you did. And I really respect her decision to make it her own. And I can see how impactful that would be in becoming a more whole, fulfilled, empowered person. I also absolutely love what she said about holding space. We hear this phrase a lot right now. It's kind of buzzy, but Barb's take on it as a reminder to herself to sit with someone with the purpose of letting them know that they aren't alone instead of trying to fix them. I don't know, just added like a layer of meaning to it for me. And I just really, I don't know, it feels good. I love it. And of course, lastly, the waiting. To quote Barb, the circumstances of how our waiting unfolds and how the fulfillment of our longings unfold, it all matters. It's not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. Waiting can be absolutely brutal, but the reminder and the message is that there is meaning in the waiting. There is a reason, whatever it is hasn't happened yet, or whatever the details are of the circumstances, what you learn, what you experience, what you feel in the waiting matters. It's very cool. I really, really dig this conversation. I don't know, I just really love it, Barb. I love everything you're doing. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.